The day I heard my own children arguing about who would get my house. I wasn't lying in a hospital bed. I wasn't gone. I was standing just a few feet away, holding a basket of clean laundry. They didn't know I could hear every word. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply made one quiet decision that would change every one of their lives forever. The very next morning, I changed my will. I wasn't supposed to hear them talking about my money. If I had walked a little slower that afternoon, I probably never would have known what my own family really thought of me. Sometimes I wish that had happened. Sometimes I wish I had stayed outside for just one more minute. But life has a strange way of showing us the truth when we're finally ready to see it. It was a quiet Saturday in early October. The kind of afternoon that made the whole neighborhood feel peaceful. The trees outside my kitchen window had just started changing colors. A cool breeze carried dry leaves across the front yard, and somewhere down the street, children laughed while riding their bikes. It felt like an ordinary day. My family had come over for lunch. That wasn't unusual. I always loved having everyone together. My son Daniel had brought his wife, Melissa, and their 2 boys. My daughter Rachel arrived a little later with her teenage daughter, Emma. The house felt full again. That old house had seen almost 50 years of birthdays, Christmas mornings, Thanksgiving dinners, and Sunday afternoons filled with laughter. Every room carried a memory. The kitchen still smelled like homemade chicken soup. The dining table still had a tiny scratch where Daniel had dropped one of his toy trucks when he was 6 years old. The hallway still held family pictures that my late husband, George, insisted on hanging himself. Every corner reminded me of the life we built together. George had been gone for almost 7 years. Not a single day passed without me thinking about him. Sometimes I still reached across the bed in the middle of the night before remembering that his side had been empty for years. Grief changes with time. It never truly leaves. It simply becomes quieter. That afternoon had started beautifully. Melissa helped set the table. Rachel brought dessert. The grandchildren laughed in the backyard. For a little while, everything felt normal. I watched everyone eating together and smiled to myself. George would have loved this. He always said a full table meant a full heart. After lunch, everyone wandered into different parts of the house. The kids went outside. Daniel answered a phone call on the back porch. Melissa carried empty dishes into the kitchen. Rachel said she wanted another cup of coffee. I offered to make fresh coffee for everyone. "Don't worry, Mom," Daniel said with a smile. "We'll clean up." I smiled back. "You know I can't sit still." He laughed. "You've been saying that for 40 years. Maybe he was right. Keeping busy had always been part of who I was. I rinsed a few plates, wiped the counters, and started another pot of coffee. The rich smell slowly filled the kitchen. It reminded me of Sunday mornings with George. Fresh coffee. Soft music. Newspapers spread across the table. Simple things. Those were always the happiest memories. When the coffee finished brewing, I realized we were almost out of sugar. I kept extra bags downstairs in the pantry near the laundry room. It took only a minute to walk down those old wooden steps. The stairs creaked exactly the way they always had. George used to promise he'd fix them. He never did. Eventually we stopped noticing. I grabbed the sugar and started back upstairs. That's when everything changed. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard voices coming from the dining room. I wasn't trying to listen. In fact, I almost walked straight in. But then I heard my own name. "Mom doesn't really need all this anymore." I froze. My hand tightened around the bag of sugar. I recognized Daniel's voice. There was a short silence. Then Melissa spoke. "The house alone has to be worth at least $800,000. Someone quietly laughed. "Rachel." "I checked online last month," she said. "Maybe even more." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood. Surely they were talking about something else. Maybe taxes. Maybe insurance. Maybe repairs. I stayed where I was. Not because I wanted to spy. Because something inside me suddenly felt very wrong. Daniel sighed. I just hope everything's divided fairly. Melissa answered before anyone else could. Fairly? We all know Rachel always gets what she wants. Rachel laughed. Oh please. Daniel already got help buying his first house. That was years ago. It still counts. I stood completely still. The sugar bag felt heavier every second. Then I heard words I'll never forget. I just don't want the house sold before we can decide who gets what. My heart skipped. Who gets what? The house I was still living in. The dining room where they sat. The kitchen where lunch dishes were still drying. The porch where I'd rocked my grandchildren to sleep. My home. I hadn't even considered that they might already be planning their lives around what I would leave behind. Melissa lowered her voice. We should probably ask her where the important papers are. Rachel replied quietly. Or maybe convince her to put one of us on the accounts now. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Then he said something that still echoes inside my head. It'll make everything easier later. Later. Such a simple word. But suddenly it sounded like they were waiting for me to disappear. Not because they hated me. Not because they wished me harm. Simply because my absence would make life easier. I leaned against the hallway wall. For the first time in years, I felt like a stranger inside my own home. The laughter from the backyard floated through the open window. Life outside continued as if nothing had changed. Cars drove past. Birds sang. The coffee maker beeped. Everything looked exactly the same. But nothing felt the same anymore. Rachel spoke again. I just hope Mom doesn't change anything at the last minute. Melissa chuckled softly. Why would she? Daniel answered quietly. She trusts us. Those 4 words hurt more than everything else. She trusts us. I did. With my whole heart. I had trusted them with every birthday. Every Christmas. Every family secret. Every dream George and I had built together. And now? They were discussing my money while I was still alive. Not once had anyone asked if I was happy. If I was lonely. If I needed help. If I missed Dad. Instead, they were talking about bank accounts. Property. Legal papers. Inheritance. I felt something inside me quietly break. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Like an old photograph slowly fading in the sun. I could have walked into the room. I could have asked them what they meant. I could have cried. I could have shouted. Instead, I quietly turned around. I carried the unopened bag of sugar back downstairs. I sat alone on the bottom step. For a long time, I simply listened to the washing machine humming beside me. I don't know how long I stayed there. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe 30. I only knew one thing. The people upstairs still loved what I owned more than they realized they loved me. When I finally stood up, I wiped my eyes before anyone could see. I smiled when I returned upstairs. I poured coffee. Passed around dessert. Asked about school. Laughed at my grandson's joke. No one noticed anything different. No one realized I had heard every word. That night, after everyone left, I walked through every room in the house. George's chair was still by the fireplace. Our wedding picture still hung in the hallway. The old clock still ticked above the mantel. Everything looked exactly as it always had. But I wasn't the same woman who had welcomed her family that morning. I sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight. Then I opened the small drawer beside the refrigerator. Inside was George's favorite fountain pen. The pen he had used to sign every important paper during our marriage. I held it in my hands for a long time. Finally, I whispered the words I never imagined I would have to say. Tomorrow. I'm changing my will. And for the first time since losing my husband. I cried not because I missed him, but because I suddenly understood what he had tried to warn me about years before. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the same voices. The house has to be worth at least $800,000. She trusts us. The words played over and over until the first light of morning slipped through my bedroom curtains. I got out of bed before my alarm, something I hadn't done in years. The house felt unusually quiet. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet I used to enjoy. It felt heavy. I walked into the kitchen and started the coffee maker. The familiar smell filled the room, but it didn't comfort me the way it usually did. I carried my mug to the back porch, wrapped a light sweater around my shoulders, and watched the sun rise over the backyard George had loved so much. He used to say mornings told the truth. If you can enjoy your coffee before the world wakes up, he'd tell me with a smile, you're richer than most people. Back then, I thought he was joking. Now I finally understood what he meant. George never measured wealth by dollars. He measured it by peace. By love. By family gathered around one table. We weren't born with much. When we got married, George was 24 and I was 22. Our first apartment was so small that the kitchen table doubled as my sewing station. The bedroom barely fit our bed. The heater worked only when it felt like it. During our first winter together, we wore sweaters inside the apartment because we couldn't afford to keep the heat on all day. Looking back, those were some of the happiest days of my life. We had very little. But we had each other. George worked long hours at a local construction company. I worked mornings at the public library. At night, we'd sit on that tiny couch and dream about the future. We're going to have a house one day, George would say. Nothing fancy. Just a place where our kids always know they're welcome. That was his dream. Not a mansion. Not a fortune. Just a home. 3 years later, Daniel was born. The moment George held him, I saw tears in his eyes. I built houses my whole life, he whispered. But this little boy, he's the greatest thing I'll ever build. 2 years later, Rachel came along. She had bright blue eyes and the loudest cry in the hospital. Daniel adored her from the very beginning. He followed her everywhere. If Rachel laughed, Daniel laughed. If Rachel cried, Daniel cried too. Watching them grow up filled our home with a kind of happiness money could never buy. There were scraped knees. Science projects spread across the dining room table. Birthday cakes that leaned sideways because I wasn't very good at decorating them. Christmas mornings that started before sunrise because the kids couldn't wait another minute. George always played Santa. Even when Daniel was old enough to know better, he pretended not to notice. For my husband's sake. That was the kind of family we were. Or at least, that's what I believed. Years passed faster than I ever expected. Daniel became interested in business. Rachel wanted to teach elementary school. George worked hard every single day. Sometimes too hard. His hands became rough from years of lifting lumber and swinging hammers. At night, I'd rub lotion into his cracked skin while we watched old movies together. He'd smile and say, "These hands built our life." He wasn't wrong. Eventually, we bought this very house. It wasn't perfect. The roof leaked. The wallpaper looked like something from another decade. The backyard was nothing but dirt. But when George handed me the keys, he grinned like he'd won the lottery. "Welcome home," he said. I still remember standing in the empty living room. There wasn't any furniture yet. Our voices echoed off the walls. Daniel and Rachel ran from room to room, picking out bedrooms. George wrapped his arm around my shoulders. "This," he whispered, "is where our family grows old together." I believed him. Every paycheck after that went into making this house a home. We planted the maple tree in the front yard ourselves. It was barely taller than Daniel. Now it stretches higher than the roof. George built the back deck one summer with help from Daniel. Rachel painted flower pots every spring. Every wall held memories. Every room carried laughter. The house wasn't valuable because of the market. It was valuable because our lives happened inside it. As the years passed, our children grew into adults. They moved out. Started careers. Got married. Built lives of their own. And George and I couldn't have been prouder. Whenever they needed help, we gave it. Not because we were wealthy. Because we were parents. When Daniel wanted to buy his first home, we quietly paid his down payment. He cried when we handed him the check. "I'll pay you back." George smiled. "No. You'll do the same for your children someday." When Rachel went back to college for her master's degree, we paid her tuition. She hugged us both. "I don't know how to thank you." George kissed her forehead. "You already did. You became the woman we hoped you'd become." Neither child ever asked for those gifts. We offered them gladly. We never kept score. That's what family does. At least, that's what George believed. As retirement grew closer, people often asked if we worried about money. George always laughed. "We've got enough. What matters now is making memories." And that's exactly what we did. Road trips. Family picnics. Birthday dinners. Sunday afternoons with the grandchildren. Life felt full. Then everything changed. George collapsed while trimming the hedge one autumn afternoon. At first, he insisted he was just dizzy. The ambulance arrived within minutes. I rode beside him to the hospital, holding his hand the entire way. He squeezed my fingers and smiled. "I'll be okay." Those were the last words he ever spoke to me. A massive heart attack. The doctors did everything they could. But sometimes love isn't enough to keep someone here. The funeral felt like a dream I couldn't wake up from. People filled the church. Neighbors. Friends. Co-workers. Family. Everyone told me how kind George had been. How hardworking. How dependable. They were right. After everyone went home, I sat alone in our living room. The silence was louder than anything I'd ever heard. I honestly didn't know how to live without him. For weeks, I caught myself reaching for the phone to call him. Sometimes I'd hear a funny story and think, "I can't wait to tell George." Then I'd remember. The loneliness came in waves. Some days I managed. Other days I cried while folding laundry because one of his old shirts was still hanging in the closet. Daniel and Rachel visited often during that first year. They worried about me. They called almost every evening. The grandchildren came by whenever they could. Those visits meant everything. Slowly, life became manageable again. Not happy. Not the way it used to be. But peaceful. I learned to enjoy quiet mornings. Gardening. Reading on the back porch. Volunteering twice a week at the community food pantry. I wasn't rich. I was simply comfortable. George had planned well. He always believed that if one of us left first, the other should never have to worry. Looking back now, I realize he planned for almost everything. Almost. There was one thing neither of us ever imagined. We never imagined that one day our children would stop seeing this house as their childhood home and start seeing it as an inheritance. I wish that had been the hardest lesson waiting for me. But the deepest heartbreak was still ahead. For the first year after George passed away, my children called almost every day. Sometimes the conversations lasted only 5 minutes. Sometimes we talked for an hour. Daniel would ask if I had eaten. Rachel would remind me to lock the doors before bed. The grandchildren filled my phone with silly pictures and school stories. Those calls became part of my routine. They reminded me that even though George was gone, I still had family. Or at least, I thought I did. Life has a quiet way of changing. Not all at once. Not with one big moment. It changes little by little, until one day you look around and realize everything feels different. That's exactly what happened to us. At first, the phone calls became shorter. "Hey, Mom. Just checking in. I've got another meeting. We'll talk this weekend." Sometimes they really did call back. Sometimes they forgot. I never complained. They had jobs. Children. Busy lives. I remembered what it was like to juggle work and family. So I always told myself the same thing. They're just busy. When Daniel missed Sunday dinner for the first time in years, he apologized. "I'm sorry, Mom. The boys have soccer tournaments every weekend. Maybe next Sunday." I smiled. Of course. Family comes first. Looking back now, I realize something. I never stopped making excuses for them. Every disappointment found a reason. Every broken promise became understandable. Every missed visit became normal. Because believing they were busy hurt less than believing they simply didn't want to come. Rachel still visited once or twice a month. She'd bring coffee. We'd sit on the porch. Talk about work. Talk about Emma getting ready for college. But even those visits slowly changed. She started checking her phone more often. Sometimes she'd glance at the clock. I should probably get going. We'd barely been together an hour. I never asked her to stay longer. Love shouldn't have to be begged for. One rainy afternoon she walked through the living room, looking carefully at the walls. I noticed her studying the old grandfather clock near the fireplace. George had inherited it from his father. It wasn't expensive. But it had been in the family for almost 80 years. Rachel smiled. "Dad always loved that clock." "He did. It still works?" "Every single day." She nodded quietly. Then she asked a question that felt strange. "So, have you ever thought about who'll get it someday?" The question surprised me. I laughed softly. "I haven't really thought that far ahead." She smiled back. "I guess it's something families eventually have to figure out." Maybe she was right. Still. The question stayed with me long after she left. A few weeks later, Daniel stopped by after work. We sat in the kitchen drinking coffee. He looked uncomfortable. Like he wanted to ask something. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mom. Have you ever made a will?" I looked at him over the rim of my coffee cup. "I have. Dad and I made one years ago." He nodded. "Good. That's smart." Then he looked down at the table. "You should probably keep it updated." I smiled politely. "I suppose." There was an awkward silence. Finally he stood. "Well, I should get home." That conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. As soon as the front door closed, I found myself staring at the empty chair across from me. George used to sit there every evening. He would have noticed what I was pretending not to see. The questions weren't really about planning. They were about timing. Winter arrived early that year. The maple tree in the front yard stood bare against gray skies. I spent more evenings indoors, knitting blankets for the children's hospital. The quiet didn't bother me. In fact, I had learned to enjoy it. Then one afternoon Melissa called. She almost never called me directly. "Hi, Mom." Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. I was wondering. "Would you like us to help organize your paperwork?" I frowned. "What paperwork?" "You know. Insurance. Bank accounts. Property records. So everything's easier someday." I thanked her kindly. But I told her everything was already organized. She laughed. "You're always so prepared." After we hung up, I walked into my home office. Inside the bottom drawer of my desk sat a neat blue folder. George had labeled it years ago. Family documents. Every paper was exactly where it belonged. Insurance. Mortgage. Savings. Investments. The will. Everything. George liked being prepared. He believed preparation was one final act of kindness for the people you leave behind. As I held that folder, I remembered something he had said only a few months before he passed away. If people ever start asking more about your money than your happiness. He paused. Pay attention. At the time I laughed. What kind of conversation is that? He smiled sadly. I've seen too many families fall apart after someone dies. Money changes people. I shook my head. Not our children. He squeezed my hand. I hope you're right. I had been so certain. Now. I wasn't sure anymore. Christmas came a few weeks later. It had always been my favorite holiday. George made pancakes every Christmas morning. The grandchildren opened presents by the fireplace. Music filled every room. This year felt different before anyone even arrived. Everyone showed up late. Daniel spent half the afternoon answering work emails. Rachel seemed distracted. Melissa kept talking about housing prices in the neighborhood. At first I barely noticed. Until she looked around the living room and smiled. This place has gone up in value so much. Daniel nodded. You'd never find another house like this now. Rachel added quietly. It's probably the biggest asset in the family. The biggest asset. Not. The place where Dad taught us to ride bicycles. Not. The home where Mom still lived. An asset. I looked around the room. The fireplace where stockings had once hung. The staircase where Christmas photos had been taken every year. The window George decorated with lights every December. Somehow, the memories had become numbers. I excused myself and went into the kitchen. I stood at the sink pretending to wash dishes. No one followed. No one noticed I was gone. For the first time in my life, I felt lonely inside a house full of family. A few weeks later, Emma came by alone. She was 17 now. Tall. Kind. Thoughtful. She had George's gentle smile. She helped me bake blueberry muffins without me even asking. While they cooled on the counter, she looked around the kitchen. I love this house, Grandma. I smiled. So do I. She hesitated. I hope you never sell it. I laughed softly. I wasn't planning to. She looked relieved. Then she said something that caught me off guard. I heard Mom and Uncle Daniel talking about it. My hand stopped moving. What did they say? Emma looked uncomfortable. I don't think they realized I was listening. They were wondering how much the house would sell for. She quickly added. They probably didn't mean anything bad. Maybe. Maybe not. I smiled anyway. It's all right, sweetheart. She hugged me before leaving. After she drove away, I stood alone on the front porch watching the empty street. Children were playing basketball 2 houses down. A neighbor walked his dog. The world looked exactly the same. But inside me, something had quietly shifted. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was disappointment. The kind that settles deep inside your heart. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that simply changes the way you see people. Still, I wasn't ready to believe the worst. I kept hoping I was misunderstanding everything. I kept hoping my family was still the family George and I had spent our lives building. I wanted to believe that more than anything. But only a few months later. One ordinary Saturday afternoon. I would hear a conversation that would leave no room for doubt. And after that, nothing in my life would ever be the same. Saturday afternoons used to be my favorite. They reminded me of the years when George would spend the morning working in the yard while I cooked enough food to feed half the neighborhood. By noon, the children would be running through the house, laughing so loudly that we could hardly hear the television. Back then, I believed those moments would last forever. That Saturday began much the same way. Daniel called around 10 that morning. "Mom, we're all coming over for lunch." "That sounds wonderful," I said. "Don't work too hard," he laughed. "I'll bring dessert." Rachel texted a few minutes later. "See you around noon." "Need me to bring anything?" "Just yourselves," I replied. I smiled as I slipped my phone back into my pocket. Even after everything that had been bothering me, I still looked forward to seeing my family. Maybe, I told myself, I had imagined the distance between us. Maybe everyone was simply tired. Maybe I was reading too much into little things. Those thoughts stayed with me while I prepared lunch. I made George's favorite pot roast. Fresh mashed potatoes. Green beans with butter. Homemade rolls. The apple pie had finished baking just before noon, filling the house with the sweet smell of cinnamon. For a few hours, everything felt normal again. The grandchildren raced through the backyard. Daniel stood on the deck flipping burgers for the kids. Rachel laughed while helping me set the table. Melissa complimented the pie. "You always make the best desserts." I smiled. "Your father-in-law always said pie tastes better when it's shared." She smiled politely, but I noticed she quickly looked at her phone. It was only a small moment. One I might have ignored months earlier. Now, I noticed everything. Lunch was warm and comfortable. We talked about work. The grandchildren's school. Summer vacation plans. The weather. No one argued. No one raised their voice. If someone had taken a picture of us, they would have seen a happy family gathered around one table. Pictures don't always tell the truth. After lunch, everyone drifted into different rooms. The children ran outside. Daniel stepped onto the back porch to answer a business call. Melissa and Rachel carried dishes into the kitchen. I began wiping the dining room table. "I'll grab more coffee," I said. "No rush, Mom," Rachel replied. "We're not going anywhere." Those words should have comforted me. Instead, they made me smile sadly. I walked toward the pantry at the far end of the hallway. Halfway there, I realized I had forgotten the extra coffee filters downstairs. I turned toward the basement steps. The old wooden stairs groaned beneath my feet, just as they had for decades. George always promised he would replace them. He never got around to it. Funny how the little unfinished things become precious after someone is gone. I found the coffee filters on the shelf beside the laundry room. As I climbed back upstairs, I heard voices coming from the dining room. I slowed without meaning to. At first, I assumed they were still talking about lunch. Then I heard my name. I stopped. There was no plan to listen. No intention of spying. But once you hear your own name spoken in a quiet room, it's almost impossible to keep walking. Daniel spoke first. "We really should know what's in the will." Rachel answered softly. "I've wondered that too." Melissa let out a quiet sigh. "I just hope everything is divided fairly." There was a long silence. Then Daniel spoke again. "The house is worth more than we thought." Someone shuffled papers. I couldn't see them from where I stood, but I could hear every word. Rachel said, "The houses on this street have doubled in value." Melissa replied, "If it's sold, everyone could get a nice amount." My heart tightened. They weren't asking whether I wanted to stay in my home. They were already discussing what would happen after I was gone. Daniel lowered his voice. "I don't think Mom should be living alone forever." Rachel answered carefully. "That's true. But she loves this place." Melissa spoke almost immediately. "She'll have to leave it someday." Her words were calm. Matter of fact. As if she were discussing the weather. Not my life. I rested one hand against the hallway wall. Suddenly, the house felt strangely unfamiliar. This was the same dining room where we celebrated birthdays. The same room where George had taught Daniel how to carve a Thanksgiving turkey. The same room where Rachel announced she was expecting Emma. Now it had become a place where my future was being measured in dollars. Daniel cleared his throat. We should probably convince her to simplify everything. Rachel asked, What do you mean? Sell the house. Move into assisted living. It would make things easier. Easier. That word settled heavily in my chest. Easier for whom? No one had asked whether that was what I wanted. No one had asked if I was happy. I still drove myself. Cooked my own meals. Paid every bill on time. Tended my garden. Volunteered twice a week. I wasn't struggling. I was simply getting older. Melissa laughed quietly. If she waits another 10 years, who knows what repairs this place will need? Rachel replied, That's true. Daniel added, almost casually. We just have to handle things before they become complicated. Before they become complicated. I understood exactly what he meant. I was the complication. Not intentionally. Not cruelly. Simply by continuing to live. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me incredibly sad. Because I knew my children weren't bad people. They had become practical. Too practical. Somewhere along the way, they had stopped seeing me as their mother. Instead, they saw responsibilities. Paperwork. Assets. Decisions waiting to be made. For a moment, I considered walking into the room. I imagined setting the coffee filters on the table and saying, I'm still here. But what would that accomplish? Would they deny it? Apologize because they were caught? Pretend I'd misunderstood? None of those answers would erase what I'd already heard. Truth doesn't become untrue simply because people wish they hadn't spoken it aloud. So I quietly stepped backward. One careful step at a time. The old floor creaked beneath my feet, and I held my breath, afraid they might hear me. They didn't. They continued talking. Their voices faded as I returned to the kitchen. I stood at the sink for several moments before turning on the faucet. The running water helped hide the sound of my breathing. When everyone wandered back into the kitchen a few minutes later, I greeted them with the same gentle smile I always wore. Coffee's ready, I said. No one noticed my red eyes. No one asked if I was all right. We shared slices of apple pie. The grandchildren laughed over a board game in the living room. Daniel complimented the roast. Rachel hugged me before she left. Melissa thanked me for lunch. Everything looked perfectly normal. That was the strangest part. A family can smile together while carrying secrets no one else can see. By early evening, the driveway was empty again. The silence returned. I locked the front door, washed the last coffee cup, and turned off the kitchen light. Then I walked slowly through every room of the house. I paused in front of the family photographs lining the hallway. There was George holding baby Daniel. Rachel on her first day of kindergarten. Christmas mornings. Graduations. Wedding pictures. So many smiles. So many promises. I reached the photograph from our 40th wedding anniversary. George had his arm around my shoulders. We both looked older. A little grayer. But happy. I gently touched the frame. I wish you were here, I whispered. I don't know what to do. Of course, there was no answer. Only the quiet ticking of the old grandfather clock. I sat in George's favorite chair until the room grew dark. The pain inside me wasn't sharp anymore. It had settled into something calmer. Something clearer. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't confused. I wasn't wondering if I had imagined the signs. I knew the truth now. And with that truth came a decision. The next morning, I would call the attorney who had helped George and me years earlier. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted to punish anyone. But because I wanted the final chapter of my life to reflect the values George and I had spent decades living by. Love should never be measured by what someone expects to receive. And if my last decisions meant anything at all, they had to be made with a clear heart, not a broken one. The next morning, I woke before the sun. For a few moments, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hoping the day before had been nothing more than a bad dream. I listened to the quiet hum of the ceiling fan and the soft chirping of birds outside my window. Then I remembered. Every word. Every sentence. Every quiet laugh. The ache in my chest returned, but it wasn't as sharp as it had been the night before. Somehow, during those long hours of silence, my sadness had settled into something else. Clarity. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. If someone had asked me years ago how I would react if my own children talked about my money while I was still alive, I probably would have said I'd never speak to them again. But that wasn't how I felt. I still loved them. That was the hardest part. Love doesn't disappear just because someone disappoints you. Sometimes it stays exactly where it has always been, even while your heart quietly breaks. I made my bed, folded the blanket neatly across the foot of it, and walked into the kitchen. The house felt different that morning. Not emptier. Just quieter. Almost as if it were waiting for me to make an important decision. I poured myself a cup of coffee and carried it into the living room. George's photograph sat on the bookshelf beside his favorite chair. I picked up the frame and smiled. You always said people show you who they are. I guess I finally listened. For a long moment, I simply held the picture. I wasn't asking George what to do. Somewhere deep inside, I already knew. I was asking for the courage to do it. After breakfast, I opened the drawer where we had always kept important papers. Everything was exactly where George had left it. Insurance documents. Property records. Investment statements. And our will. The folder was worn around the edges from age, but George's handwriting was still clear across the front. Family estate plan. I carried it to the kitchen table. For nearly an hour, I read every page. George and I had written those instructions almost 15 years earlier. Back then, everything had seemed simple. When one of us passed away, the other would inherit everything. After both of us were gone, whatever remained would be divided equally between Daniel and Rachel. It had always seemed fair. At the time, we never imagined there would be any reason to change it. George believed fairness meant equal shares. But as I sat there reading those old pages, I realized something. Fairness and love aren't always the same thing. Sometimes treating everyone equally ignores the truth of how people have treated one another. That realization stayed with me as I reached for my phone. My hands trembled slightly while I searched through my contacts. The attorney's name was still there. Michael Harper. George had trusted him for years. I pressed the call button. The receptionist answered after the second ring. Good morning, Harper and Associates. Good morning, I replied softly. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to schedule an appointment to update my will. Of course, Mrs. Brooks. We have an opening this afternoon. I looked around the quiet house. This afternoon would be fine. The drive across town felt strangely peaceful. The autumn leaves lined both sides of the road. People hurried into coffee shops. Children waited for school buses. Life continued exactly as it always had. Only mine had quietly changed. When I arrived, Michael greeted me himself. He looked older than I remembered. More gray hair. Reading glasses resting low on his nose. But his smile hadn't changed. Eleanor. It's good to see you. I wish George were walking in with you. I smiled gently. So do I. He led me into his office. The same office where George and I had laughed years earlier while signing retirement papers. Back then, we'd talked about vacations. Grandchildren. Growing old together. Neither of us imagined I would one day sit in that same chair alone. Michael placed a yellow legal pad on his desk. So, he said kindly. What would you like to change? For a moment, I couldn't answer. Instead, I looked out the window. Finally, I took a slow breath. I thought I knew exactly what I wanted. But now that I'm here. My voice faded. Michael didn't interrupt. He simply waited. Good listeners know silence has its own purpose. After a few moments, I found my words again. My children aren't bad people. They've just forgotten what matters. He nodded quietly. I understand. I don't want revenge. I don't want to hurt anyone. I just don't want my life's work to become a prize people compete for. The room grew still. Michael folded his hands together. Tell me what happened. So I did. I told him about lunch. The conversation. The hallway. The words I couldn't forget. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't accuse. I simply told the truth. When I finished, Michael remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he spoke. You know, I've practiced law for over 30 years. I've seen families destroyed over money. More times than I care to remember. I lowered my eyes. I never believed mine would become one of them. I'm sorry. So am I. Michael slid the old will across the desk. Let's talk about what reflects your values. Not your anger. Your values. Those words mattered. Because I realized that's exactly what I wanted. Not punishment. Purpose. George and I had always believed money was a tool. Never the goal. If it could make someone's life better, then that's where it belonged. I smiled for the first time that day. I'd like to make some changes. He nodded. I'm listening. I began with something that had been on my heart for years. The children's hospital. Michael looked up. The one where your granddaughter volunteered? Yes. They helped George during his final days. I've never forgotten their kindness. He wrote a note. Done. Next, I thought about my church. Not because of the building. Because of the people. They had brought meals after George died. Called when I felt lonely. Sat beside me when grief felt too heavy. They never expected anything in return. I'd like to leave them something too. Michael smiled. They'll be grateful. Then I remembered Mrs. Alvarez. My next-door neighbor. She had mowed my lawn after George passed. Brought soup when I caught the flu. Checked on me during every snowstorm. Never once asking for anything. She deserves to know how much her kindness meant. Michael wrote her name carefully. One by one, we talked about people who had shown genuine love. Not because they expected a reward. Simply because they cared. As the list grew, I felt lighter. Almost peaceful. Finally, Michael looked back at me. And your children? I took a long breath. They'll still receive something. But not because they're entitled to it. Because they're my children. I also want each of them to receive a letter. A personal letter. Michael nodded slowly. Sometimes words become the greatest inheritance. I smiled through tears. I hope so. As we continued making notes, I realized I wasn't rewriting my will because my family had hurt me. I was rewriting it because George and I had spent our lives believing that generosity should follow kindness. And I wanted my final decisions to reflect the people who had lived by those same values. For the first time since that painful Saturday afternoon, my heart felt just a little bit lighter. I had not chosen revenge. I had chosen peace. And somehow, peace felt far more powerful. When I walked out of Michael Harper's office that afternoon, the air felt cooler than it had a few hours earlier. A gentle breeze carried bright orange leaves across the parking lot. I stood beside my car for a moment, watching them dance across the pavement. It had been one of the hardest conversations of my life. Yet somehow, I didn't feel heavier. I felt calmer. The sadness was still there. I knew it would stay with me for a long time. But beneath that sadness was something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. I climbed into my car and drove home without turning on the radio. Silence didn't bother me anymore. It gave me room to think. As I stopped at a red light, I found myself remembering something George used to say whenever life became complicated. You can't control what people choose. You can only control what kind of person you choose to be. At the time, those words had seemed simple. Now they felt like the answer I had been searching for. When I pulled into my driveway, Mrs. Alvarez was kneeling beside the flower bed that separated our yards. She looked up and smiled. "There you are. I was starting to wonder where you'd disappeared to." I laughed softly. "I just had a few errands." She stood, brushed the dirt from her gardening gloves, and walked over carrying a small basket. "I baked too many blueberry muffins this morning." "I know that's impossible," I teased. She laughed. "It is. But I thought you might help me prove it." We sat together on my front porch. No special occasion. No important conversation. Just two neighbors sharing coffee and fresh muffins. She talked about her grandson learning to drive. I told her about the tomatoes that never seemed to grow quite right anymore. An hour passed without either of us noticing. As she stood to leave, she placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You've seemed quieter lately. You doing okay?" I smiled. "I've had a lot on my mind." She nodded. "You know where I live. If you ever need anything." There was no curiosity in her voice. No pressure. She didn't ask questions because she wanted information. She asked because she genuinely cared. After she walked home, I sat alone on the porch for several more minutes. Then I whispered to myself. This is what love looks like. Not expensive gifts. Not promises. Just showing up. The following Tuesday, I volunteered at the community food pantry. I'd been helping there for almost 5 years. George had started volunteering first. After he passed away, I kept going. It made me feel close to him. The pantry wasn't anything fancy. Just a modest brick building beside the church. Shelves lined with canned goods. Boxes of fresh produce. Volunteers greeting every visitor with a smile. People often thanked us for helping. But they never realized how much they helped us, too. That afternoon, I worked beside a young mother named Hannah. She couldn't have been older than 30. Her husband had passed away unexpectedly 2 years earlier, leaving her to raise 2 little boys alone. She worked full-time. Still, money was tight. Yet every Tuesday she volunteered before picking up her children from school. One of the other volunteers quietly asked her, "Why do you keep helping everyone else when you've already got so much on your shoulders?" Hannah smiled while stacking canned soup onto a shelf. "Because someone helped me. I don't ever want to forget that." Those words stayed with me all afternoon. Kindness has a way of multiplying. One person receives it. Then passes it forward. George believed that. So did I. A few days later, Daniel called. "Hey, Mom." His voice sounded cheerful. "Just checking in." We talked about the weather. The boys' baseball season. His busy schedule. It was an easy conversation. Then his tone changed ever so slightly. "By the way, have you talked to your financial advisor lately?" I looked out the kitchen window. "Not recently." "You probably should. I've just been thinking. You don't want things getting complicated someday." There was that word again. Complicated. I answered gently. "I appreciate your concern. But everything's under control." There was a brief silence. "Okay. I just wanted to make sure." After we hung up, I stared at the phone for several seconds. Months earlier, I probably wouldn't have thought twice about that conversation. Now every question carried a different meaning. Not because I wanted to assume the worst. Because experience had taught me to listen more carefully. Rachel visited the following weekend. She brought fresh flowers. Yellow daisies. My favorite, I said. I remembered. She placed them in a vase and looked around the kitchen. Everything looks exactly the same. I like it that way. She smiled. Dad probably would too. For a little while, everything felt almost normal. We baked chocolate chip cookies together. Just like we used to when she was little. She accidentally spilled flour across the counter. We laughed. It reminded me of happier years. As she prepared to leave, she hesitated near the front door. Mom. Can I ask you something? Of course. Have you ever thought about moving somewhere smaller? The question wasn't unkind. But it still made my heart sink. I love this house. I know. It's just. She searched for the right words. It seems like a lot for one person. I smiled gently. It holds an entire lifetime. She nodded. I understand. But somehow. I wasn't sure she really did. That evening, I walked slowly through every room. The hallway. The living room. George's workshop. Our bedroom. Every space carried a memory no one else could fully understand. The little mark on the pantry door where Daniel measured his height every birthday. The faded spot in the carpet where Rachel's puppy used to sleep. The tiny crack in the kitchen tile George always promised to replace. People looking at this house saw property. I saw my life. A week later, Michael called. I finished preparing the new documents. They're ready whenever you'd like to sign. I thanked him and scheduled another appointment. This time, I didn't feel nervous. I felt certain. Not because I had stopped loving my children. Because I had remembered something important. A will isn't only about money. It's the final letter you leave behind. The last chance to say, this is what mattered to me. George had spent his life teaching our children that character mattered more than possessions. I wanted my final message to say exactly the same thing. The money would eventually be spent. The house would someday belong to someone else. Furniture would wear out. Jewelry would be passed from one hand to another. But kindness could outlive every dollar I had ever earned. As the sun began to set outside my living room window, I looked at George's photograph one more time. I think you'd be proud of this decision, I whispered. In the quiet that followed, I imagined his familiar smile. Not because I believed he could answer me. But because, after nearly 50 years together, I knew exactly what he would have said. You did the right thing. For the first time in many months. I believed it too. And although I didn't know it yet, the hardest conversation of all was still waiting for my family. 3 days later, I returned to Michael's office. The morning was cool and bright. The kind of morning George always loved because it made the whole world feel fresh again. As I walked inside, the receptionist smiled. Good morning, Mrs. Brooks. Mr. Harper is expecting you. I thanked her and followed the familiar hallway. Michael stood as I entered. Good to see you again, Eleanor. It's good to be here, I answered. This time, I meant it. The stack of papers waiting on his desk looked ordinary. White pages. Black ink. A few colored tabs marking places where I needed to sign. It didn't look like something that could change the future. But I knew better. Michael slid the documents toward me. I've written everything exactly as we discussed. He paused. I'd like you to read each page slowly. There is no hurry. For the next half hour, I read every line. Some pages described the charities. Others listed small gifts for friends who had stood beside me during the hardest years of my life. Mrs. Alvarez would receive enough money to pay off the small mortgage she still carried. She would probably cry when she learned why. The community food pantry would receive a donation in George's name. The children's hospital would receive a gift to help families who couldn't afford treatment. The church would receive funds for its meal program, the same one that had quietly delivered dinners to my house after George passed away. Each decision brought back a memory. Not of money. Of kindness. When I reached the section about Daniel and Rachel, I stopped reading for a moment. Michael waited patiently. "I still love them," I whispered. "I know you do. I hope one day they understand this isn't punishment." He nodded. "Then tell them." I looked up. "What do you mean?" "Write them letters. Not legal explanations. A mother's words. They may forget numbers. They won't forget your voice." The idea settled gently into my heart. He was right. Money explains what people receive. A letter explains why. That afternoon, after I signed the last page, I stopped at a stationery shop on the way home. I bought a box of thick cream-colored paper and a package of matching envelopes. George always believed handwritten letters mattered. "They slow your thoughts down," he used to say. "They make you choose your words carefully." When I reached home, I made a pot of tea instead of coffee. I carried everything to the dining room table. The same table where birthday candles had burned. The same table where homework had been finished. The same table where I had overheard the conversation that changed everything. For several minutes, I simply looked at the blank paper. Then I picked up George's fountain pen. The first letter was for Daniel. I didn't begin with money. I began with a memory. "Dear Daniel. The first time I held you, your father whispered that he had never been so proud." The words came slowly. I wrote about teaching him to ride a bicycle. The fishing trips he loved. The summer afternoons he spent helping George build the back deck. I reminded him that he had once been the little boy who insisted on giving away his birthday toys to children who had none. I wondered when that generous little boy had become a man who worried so much about possessions. I didn't accuse him. I simply asked him to remember who he had once been. When I finished, tears rested on the paper. I folded the letter carefully. The second letter was for Rachel. I remembered her love of books. The way she used to crawl into my lap every night with another story. The handmade Mother's Day cards she filled with crooked hearts and misspelled words. I thanked her for caring for me after George's funeral. I told her those quiet evenings had helped me survive the darkest season of my life. Then I wrote something I had carried in my heart for months. "My greatest wish is that you never measure people by what they leave behind. Measure them by the love they gave while they were here." When I finished, I sat quietly for a long time. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the kitchen window. The house felt peaceful again. Not because my problems had disappeared. Because I had finally said the things that mattered. The letters weren't about changing anyone's mind. They were about leaving behind the truth. Weeks passed. Life settled into its familiar rhythm. I tended the garden. Volunteered at the pantry. Shared coffee with Mrs. Alvarez. Some afternoons were lonely. Others were surprisingly joyful. Daniel and Rachel continued to visit from time to time. They still asked careful questions about my plans. Whether I had thought about downsizing. Whether I needed help organizing paperwork. Whether everything was taken care of. I answered each question with a gentle smile. Everything is exactly where it needs to be. That answer was always true. Neither of them realized just how true it had become. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the maple tree George and I had planted decades earlier, I sat on the porch with my tea. The branches swayed gently in the breeze. Leaves drifted across the lawn. I thought about how trees spend years growing strong roots where no one can see them. Families are much the same. The strongest parts are often invisible. Trust. Respect. Kindness. When those roots begin to weaken, it takes time before anyone notices. But eventually, the whole tree begins to lean. As darkness settled over the yard, I whispered a quiet promise to myself. I won't spend whatever years I have left worrying about who deserves what. I'll spend them loving the people who choose to love me back. For the first time since that painful afternoon in the hallway. The future no longer frightened me. Whatever happened next, I knew I had already made the most important decision of my life. Winter arrived quietly that year. The maple tree in the front yard stood bare against a pale gray sky, and every morning I wrapped my hands around a warm mug of coffee while watching the neighborhood slowly wake up. Life had settled into a comfortable routine. On Mondays, I volunteered at the food pantry. Wednesdays were for grocery shopping and lunch with Mrs. Alvarez. Fridays were my favorite because my granddaughter Emma usually stopped by after her college classes. Those visits reminded me that not everything in my family had changed. Emma never arrived empty-handed. Sometimes she brought fresh bread from the bakery near campus. Sometimes she carried a bouquet of flowers she had picked up at the grocery store. More often than not, she simply brought herself. That was enough. One Friday afternoon, she found me sorting through old photo albums in the living room. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. "I was hoping you would." She sat beside me on the couch, and together we turned page after page. There was a picture of Daniel missing his 2 front teeth. Rachel holding a blue ribbon she had won at the county fair. George covered in sawdust while building the treehouse that had become every grandchild's favorite place. Emma smiled. "Grandpa always looked so happy." "He usually was." She traced her finger across one of the photographs. "I wish I'd had more time with him." "So do I." For a while, neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence says everything that words cannot. Finally, Emma looked at me. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you lonely?" The question caught me by surprise. Not because it was uncomfortable. Because it came from a place of genuine concern. I thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes. But lonely isn't the same as being alone." She nodded thoughtfully. "I think I understand. I have friends at school who are surrounded by people all day. They still feel lonely." I smiled. "Your grandfather used to say that the right person can make even an ordinary afternoon feel special." Emma laughed softly. I think he was right. Before she left, she hugged me tightly. "I'll come back next week." "I'd like that." Unlike so many promises people make, Emma kept hers. She came back the following Friday. And the Friday after that. Not because she expected anything. Because she wanted to be there. A few weeks later, Daniel invited me to dinner at his house. I accepted happily. The boys had grown so much that I almost couldn't keep up with their stories anymore. The evening started well. We ate grilled chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. The boys argued about basketball. Melissa laughed as she cleared the dishes. For a little while, everything felt almost like it used to. Then the conversation shifted. Melissa poured herself another glass of iced tea. "So, Eleanor." She rarely called me by my first name. Usually, I was simply Mom. "I've been thinking." I smiled politely. "About what?" "This house is getting harder for you to take care of, isn't it?" I set my fork down. "It's work. But I enjoy it." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "You've done an amazing job keeping it up. But maybe it's time to think about something smaller." I looked from one face to another. No one sounded cruel. No one sounded impatient. They sounded practical. As if they had discussed this before I arrived. "I appreciate your concern," I said calmly. "But I'm not ready to leave." Melissa nodded. "Of course. We're just thinking about your future." There it was again. My future. Everyone seemed eager to plan it except me. One of my grandsons looked up from his plate. "Grandma, can I still sleep in Grandpa's old room next summer?" I smiled immediately. "If you want to." His face lit up. "I love that room." Daniel glanced toward Melissa. Neither of them said anything. But I noticed the look they exchanged. It lasted only a second. Still, I noticed. A few days later, I received an unexpected phone call from my bank. The representative spoke politely. "Mrs. Brooks, someone recently contacted us asking about the process for adding a joint owner to an account." I frowned. "I didn't request that." "No, ma'am. We simply wanted to verify before discussing any account information." "Thank you." After hanging up, I sat quietly for several minutes. The bank employee had followed the rules. No information had been shared. But one question echoed through my mind. Who had called? I didn't know. And I refused to make accusations without proof. Still, it reminded me of something important. Protecting myself wasn't an act of distrust. It was an act of responsibility. That afternoon, I called Michael. "I have a question." "I'm listening," he said. "Is there anything else I should do?" He answered gently. "Keep your documents somewhere secure. And don't let anyone pressure you into making financial decisions you're not comfortable with." "I won't." Before hanging up, he added one more thought. "Eleanor, kindness doesn't require giving people control over your life." His words stayed with me long after the call ended. As spring slowly approached, my health remained good. I still drove. Still cooked. Still planted flowers in the front yard. Mrs. Alvarez often joked that I had more energy than people 20 years younger. I laughed every time she said it. One Saturday morning, while trimming the rose bushes, I noticed Daniel pulling into the driveway. He climbed out carrying a toolbox. I thought I'd help with a few repairs. His offer surprised me. It was thoughtful. And genuine. For the next 3 hours, we worked side by side. He fixed a loose porch railing. Replaced a broken cabinet hinge. Changed a light fixture in the hallway. For a little while, it felt like the old days. The days when he was just my son. Not a businessman. Not a father worrying about responsibilities. Just my boy. When we finished, we sat on the back porch with cold lemonade. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then Daniel sighed. "I miss Dad." "So do I. I still think about calling him whenever something breaks." I smiled through watery eyes. "I still do too." He laughed quietly. For one beautiful moment. There was no talk of houses. No talk of money. No talk of inheritance. Only a father being missed. And a son remembering. As he stood to leave, he hugged me. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't distracted. It felt real. Watching him drive away, I realized something important. People are rarely only one thing. My son had disappointed me. He had also just spent an entire morning helping me without asking for anything in return. That didn't erase the hurt. But it reminded me that hearts are complicated. No one is completely good. No one is completely selfish. Sometimes people lose their way. Whether they find it again, only time can answer. And time, I was beginning to learn, reveals every heart eventually. Spring came and went before I realized how much time had passed. The roses George planted along the fence bloomed brighter than they had in years. Every morning, I carried my coffee onto the back porch and watched the sunlight slowly warm the yard. Growing older has a funny way of changing your priorities. When I was younger, I worried about keeping a perfect house, finishing every chore, and making plans for the future. Now, I found joy in much smaller things. A bird building a nest beneath the porch roof. A handwritten birthday card. Fresh bread cooling on the kitchen counter. An unexpected visit from someone who simply wanted to spend time together. Those moments became my greatest treasures. One Friday afternoon, Emma arrived carrying 2 paper bags. "I brought lunch," she said with a smile. "You've spoiled me again." She laughed. "I learned from the best." We ate tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches at the kitchen table. Halfway through lunch, she looked around the room. I hope this house always feels like this. What do you mean? She smiled. Peaceful. I looked around at the familiar walls. I hope so too. After we finished eating, we opened an old wooden chest filled with family keepsakes. Inside were school report cards, faded Christmas ornaments, vacation postcards, and dozens of photographs. Emma picked up one picture of George holding her as a baby. I barely remember this. He adored you. I wish I remembered his voice. I smiled. He laughed with his whole heart. When he smiled, everyone else smiled too. She held the photograph carefully. I think that's why I like coming here. It still feels like Grandpa is part of this house. Her words filled my heart. She wasn't talking about property. She was talking about memories. There is a difference. A very important difference. As summer approached, I noticed my energy wasn't what it used to be. Simple jobs took a little longer. I needed to rest more often after working in the garden. My doctor assured me nothing was unusual. You're doing remarkably well, he said. But don't forget to slow down. I promised I would. Whether I actually listened was another matter. One afternoon, while watering flowers in the front yard, I became dizzy. It lasted only a few seconds. Still, it frightened me. Mrs. Alvarez happened to be walking across her lawn. She hurried over. Eleanor, are you all right? I'm fine. You don't look fine. She guided me to the porch swing and handed me a bottle of water. We sat together quietly until the color returned to my face. I'm calling Daniel, she said. I gently touched her arm. Please don't. I don't want anyone to panic. She looked at me carefully. You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. Let someone take care of you once in a while. Her words stayed with me. Perhaps accepting kindness is just as important as giving it. That evening, I called Daniel myself. I had a little dizzy spell today. He was silent for a moment. Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner? I didn't want you to worry. I'm coming over tomorrow. You don't have to. I'm coming anyway. The next morning, he arrived before 9. He carried groceries inside without being asked. He replaced a broken smoke detector battery. He mowed the lawn. He even fixed the squeaky screen door George had never gotten around to repairing. Watching him work reminded me of the young man who had once spent entire weekends helping his father build our deck. Before leaving, he hugged me. If you ever need anything. I know. I'll call. This time, I believed he meant it. People are complicated. Sometimes they disappoint us. Sometimes they surprise us. Both things can be true at once. A month later, I visited Michael Harper one final time. Not to change the will. That part was finished. I carried a small box instead. Inside were the handwritten letters. One for Daniel. One for Rachel. One for Emma. There were also notes for Mrs. Alvarez and the director of the community pantry. Michael accepted the box carefully. I'll keep these with your estate documents. Thank you. He looked at me for a long moment. How are you feeling? I smiled. Lighter. I spent months thinking I had to choose between loving my family and protecting my wishes. And now? I've realized I can do both. He nodded. That's wisdom. As I stood to leave, I paused at the office door. If something happens to me, I don't want my children remembering me because of money. I want them to remember Sunday dinners. The smell of fresh bread. The sound of their father's laugh. I hope they remember what really mattered. Michael smiled gently. I think your letters will help them do exactly that. Driving home, I took the long route through town. I passed the elementary school where Rachel learned to read. The baseball field where Daniel hit his first home run. The little ice cream shop George visited every anniversary. life had moved forward. Children had grown. Buildings had changed. But memories remained. When I reached home, the afternoon sun poured through the living room windows. I sat in George's favorite chair and looked around the quiet house. For the first time in a very long while. I wasn't thinking about the future. I wasn't thinking about wills. Or money. Or disappointment. I was simply grateful. Grateful for the years I had shared with George. Grateful for every happy memory. Grateful that I still had time to tell the people I loved that I loved them. Because in the end, that was worth far more than anything written on a legal document. I didn't know how many seasons I had left. But I knew exactly how I wanted to spend them. Surrounded not by possessions, but by people whose love asked for nothing in return. The visit that meant the most. Summer faded into autumn once again. The maple tree George and I had planted decades earlier was glowing with deep shades of orange and red. Every morning, I watched a few more leaves drift gently onto the front lawn. I had always loved that season. It reminded me that letting go could still be beautiful. My doctor encouraged me to take life a little slower. I listened this time. I spent fewer hours working in the garden and more hours sitting on the porch with a blanket across my lap, watching neighbors walk their dogs and children race home from school. The days felt peaceful. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel began stopping by every Wednesday evening. Sometimes he brought groceries. Sometimes he brought takeout from my favorite little diner. Other times he came with nothing at all. We would simply sit together on the porch. One evening he looked across the yard and smiled. Dad would probably tell me I missed a spot mowing this lawn. I laughed. He absolutely would. For a moment, we both laughed the way we used to. Then his smile faded. I haven't been here enough. I looked at him. I'm here now. He lowered his eyes. I know. It wasn't an apology. Not exactly. But it was the closest either of us had come to talking about the distance that had grown between us. A few days later, Rachel arrived carrying a photo album. I found this while cleaning the attic, she said. We spent the afternoon turning pages together. There were pictures from camping trips, birthday parties, school concerts, and Christmas mornings. Halfway through the album, Rachel stopped on a picture of George teaching Daniel how to use a hammer. She smiled through tears. I forgot how patient Dad was. He believed every mistake could become a lesson. Rachel quietly closed the album. I wish I'd remembered that sooner. Those words stayed with me long after she left. Not because they solved everything. Because they gave me hope that people can still grow, no matter their age. The person who visited most often, however, was still Emma. She never called first to ask if I needed anything. She simply knocked on the door. Want some company? That was always enough. One Saturday she found me making George's old beef stew recipe. I've never learned this one, she said. Then today you will. For the next 2 hours we cooked side by side. I showed her how George liked extra carrots. Why the onions had to cook slowly. Why tasting the broth mattered more than following exact measurements. She wrote everything down in a small notebook. This way, she said, smiling, I'll always make it the way Grandpa liked. I realized then that recipes aren't really about food. They're about remembering the people we shared them with. As dinner simmered on the stove, Emma asked quietly, Grandma, what do you hope people remember about you? The question caught me off guard. I looked toward the window before answering. I hope they remember that this house was always open. I hope they remember they were loved. And I hope they remember that kindness is something you choose every day. Emma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'll remember. Her words warmed my heart more than she could ever know. That evening, after she left, I walked through the quiet house one last time before bed. The hallway photographs. George's workshop. The old grandfather clock. None of them belonged in a balance sheet. They belonged in the story of our family. Standing in the living room, I realized something I hadn't understood months earlier. The greatest inheritance I could leave behind wasn't written in my will. It was written in the lives I had touched. Still, I knew the legal papers waiting in Michael Harper's office would soon have to speak for me. And when that day came, I hoped my children would hear my heart before they counted a single dollar. The first snowfall came earlier than anyone expected. When I opened the curtains that morning, the yard was covered in a blanket of white. The maple tree stood quietly in the front yard, its branches heavy with fresh snow. George always loved the first snowfall. He used to wake me before sunrise, make 2 cups of coffee, and insist we sit by the living room window just to watch the world turn white. "It's like getting a fresh page," he'd say. "You can't change yesterday, but you can decide what to write next." I thought about those words often during the final months of my life. My doctor was honest with me. There wasn't one dramatic diagnosis or a single frightening moment. It was simply time catching up with me. My heart wasn't as strong as it used to be. Walking across the yard left me out of breath. Some afternoons I needed a nap after folding laundry. I accepted those changes one day at a time. Growing older wasn't something to fear. It was simply another season of life. Daniel visited every Wednesday. Rachel usually came on Saturdays. Sometimes they arrived together. The conversations became warmer than they had been in years. We talked about George. Old vacations. Funny family stories. The grandchildren. For a while, no one mentioned the house. No one asked about money. I was grateful for that. One Wednesday evening, Daniel stayed long after dinner. We were sitting in the living room when he suddenly spoke. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course." He stared into the fireplace before answering. "Have I been a good son?" The question surprised me. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I thought about the little boy who used to wait by the front door every evening because he wanted to be the first person to hug his father after work. I remembered the teenager who spent an entire summer helping George rebuild the old porch. I remembered the young man who cried on his wedding day. Then I remembered the conversation I had overheard. Both versions of my son were real. "You've had good moments," I said softly. "And you've had moments you probably wish you could do over." He nodded. "So have I." A tear slipped down his cheek. "I've been thinking a lot lately. I don't know when I started worrying so much about money. I don't think I even noticed it happening." I reached over and held his hand. "We all lose our way sometimes. What matters is whether we find it again." He squeezed my hand tightly. "I hope I still can." "I believe you can." It wasn't forgiveness for one conversation. It was hope for the man he could still become. A week later, Rachel arrived alone. She brought coffee and 2 slices of pumpkin pie from the bakery George loved. We sat at the kitchen table for almost 3 hours. Before leaving, she looked around the room. "I used to think this house was the most important thing Dad left us." I smiled gently. "And now?" She looked toward the family photographs lining the hallway. "I think he left us something much bigger." I didn't ask her to explain. Some realizations become stronger when people discover them on their own. Christmas arrived quietly. The family gathered in the same living room where we had celebrated for decades. The grandchildren were older now. The wrapping paper wasn't scattered across every corner like it used to be. Life had changed. But laughter still filled the house. That evening, after everyone left, I sat beside the Christmas tree until the lights turned off automatically. I wasn't thinking about presents. Or legal papers. Or bank accounts. I was thinking about gratitude. Grateful for another Christmas. Grateful for another hug. Another story. Another chance to say, "I love you." A few weeks later, I called Michael. "I think it's time." He understood immediately. "I'll come to you." The following afternoon, he sat across from me in the living room. I handed him a small wooden box. Inside were the letters I had written months earlier. There was also one final envelope. It simply read, "To be read after my funeral." Michael looked at me. "Are you sure?" I smiled. "I've never been more certain." He placed the box inside his briefcase. "I'll make sure your wishes are honored." As he stood to leave, I walked him to the front door. "This house has been filled with love for nearly 50 years, I said quietly. "I hope that's what people remember." "I think they will," he replied. That night, I slept better than I had in a long time. Not because every problem had been solved, but because I had said everything that mattered. Love had been spoken. Forgiveness had been offered. My final wishes were safely in place. The rest would belong to time. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about George. I imagined him smiling that familiar smile, waiting patiently somewhere beyond my understanding. And for the first time in many years, the thought of tomorrow no longer frightened me. Whatever happened next, my family would finally hear the truth I had carried quietly in my heart. The church was filled with flowers Eleanor would have loved. Not because they were expensive, but because they were simple. White lilies rested beside the wooden casket, and photographs from different seasons of her life stood on easels near the front of the room. One showed her laughing beside George in their garden. Another captured a family Christmas decades earlier, when Daniel and Rachel were still children wearing matching sweaters. Emma stood quietly beside those photographs before the service began. She wasn't looking at the pictures. She was remembering the stories behind them. After the funeral, family and close friends gathered for a meal in the church hall. The conversations were soft. Some spoke about Eleanor's cooking. Others remembered George's gentle sense of humor. Daniel noticed Mrs. Alvarez sitting alone with a cup of coffee. He walked over. "Thank you for looking after Mom." Mrs. Alvarez smiled sadly. "Your mother looked after all of us in one way or another." Those words stayed with him. The following afternoon, Daniel, Rachel, Emma, and a few close friends met in Michael Harper's office. The room was quiet. No one spoke much while they waited. Michael entered carrying a familiar wooden box. He placed it gently on the conference table. "Before we begin," he said, "your mother left very specific instructions. She wanted today to be respectful. She hoped no one would think of this meeting as a discussion about money. She wanted it to be a conversation about the life she shared with all of you." Daniel lowered his eyes. Rachel folded her hands together. Michael opened the file. He explained Eleanor's wishes carefully. Gifts had been left to the children's hospital that cared for George. A donation would support the community food pantry where Eleanor volunteered. Funds had also been given to the church meal program that had quietly helped her after George passed away. Mrs. Alvarez received a gift along with a note thanking her for years of friendship and kindness. Tears filled her eyes before Michael had finished reading. "I never expected anything," she whispered. "I know," Michael replied. "That's exactly why she wanted to thank you." Daniel and Rachel remained silent. Then Michael reached for 2 sealed envelopes. "These are for you. They are not legal documents. They are letters from your mother." Daniel opened his first. The room seemed to disappear as he read. His mother had not written about disappointment. She had written about the little boy who waited by the front door every evening to hug his father. She reminded him of the afternoons he spent helping neighbors without being asked. She wrote that kindness had once come naturally to him and that she hoped he would find his way back to that part of himself. At the bottom of the page were the words that broke his heart. "I never stopped being proud to be your mother. I only wished we had remembered that time together was always worth more than anything I could leave behind." Daniel quietly folded the letter. He could not speak. Rachel opened hers with trembling hands. Her mother had written about bedtime stories, homemade birthday cards, and the afternoons they baked cookies together. Then came a sentence she read twice. "A home is not measured by its value. It is measured by the love people feel when they walk through its door. Rachel covered her face as tears began to fall. I should have visited more, she whispered. No amount of money can buy back a missed afternoon. No one answered. There was nothing to add. Michael waited until the room became still again. Your mother made these decisions thoughtfully. She wanted her estate to reflect the values she and George built together. It was never about punishment. It was about purpose. Emma quietly looked around the room. For the first time, she realized her grandmother had given everyone exactly what they needed. Some received financial help. Some received gratitude. Some received a second chance to look honestly at themselves. Weeks later, Daniel drove to the old house alone. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The rooms were empty now, but they did not feel lifeless. He walked slowly into the kitchen and ran his hand across the worn wooden table where so many family dinners had taken place. He remembered rushing through meals. Checking his phone. Thinking about meetings. He wished he had lingered a little longer. Rachel arrived a few minutes later. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, she smiled through tears. Do you remember how Mom always burned the first batch of pancakes? Daniel laughed. And Dad always ate them anyway. For the first time in years, they laughed together without talking about responsibilities, schedules, or property. Only memories. Before locking the front door one last time, Daniel looked back into the house. I thought this place was our inheritance, he said quietly. Rachel shook her head. No. Mom showed us what our inheritance really was. Months passed. The donations Eleanor arranged began helping families she would never meet. The pantry expanded its meal program. The hospital created a small family support fund in memory of George and Eleanor Brooks. Emma volunteered there whenever she could. She often told people about her grandparents, not because of what they owned, but because of how they lived. Years later, when someone asked Emma what her grandmother had left behind, she smiled before answering. She left us recipes, stories, forgiveness, and one lesson I'll never forget. Never wait until someone is gone to show them they're more valuable than anything they own. That became the true ending of Eleanor's story. Not the reading of a will. Not the division of an estate. But a family slowly remembering that love is never counted in dollars. It is measured in time, kindness, and the moments we choose to share while we still can.